Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to install some lights on the C14. Now you might notice something isn't quite right with the video. No, it's not your monitor, and no, you haven't forgotten your glasses. It really is just slightly out of focus. I managed to record the whole lot with the focus fixed to about 4 inches in front of the lens. On the bright side, when I hold things up to the camera, it's really sharp. Luckily, the depth of field is big enough that it's not going to be a total loss. Anyway, while talking about the little focus issue, I've taken the cab and roll bar off the chassis so we can get at all the bits we need to install the LEDs. Before we get to the LEDs though, we need to do a quick fix for the slipping drive shaft. The rear yoke that's attached to the gearbox is slipping on the shaft. It's so loose that it slides off without any fuss at all. One plus point for the stock parts, the end of the shaft has grips pressed into it already. These shafts weren't the best to begin with, and I'm not really expecting them to last all that long, but for now we might as well bodge them back together. To install the rear LEDs we're going to need to take the tray off the chassis, so you might as well do that now as it's going to make the drive shaft that little bit easier to see. Right, the fix is going to involve some 5-minute epoxy. It'll do the trick, but won't be too difficult to remove later if we need to. The shaft's already got a nice key, so all we need to do is score up the inside of the yoke to give the epoxy something to grip. A slightly blunt blade works well. We don't need sharp cuts. In fact, the messier the scores are, the better. We'll only need a tiny bit of epoxy for this. Just a spot of resin and hardener, mixed thoroughly, will do the job. Pop a little bit inside the yoke and spread it around. Again, we only need a tiny amount. The shaft and the yoke are already a sliding fit, so there's not going to be much of a gap to fill. Now we can reconnect the slider and pop the yoke over the shaft, making sure it's fully seated. Now we just have to leave it to fully harden. For the rear lights, we're going to have a bit of modding to do, as there's just these 2 bumps with red paint. They wouldn't be too hard just to drill out, except the plastic's fairly thin and they almost perfectly line up with another bit of plastic on the back. It was a fairly fiddly job, but I ended up drilling a 5mm hole through the bumps and opened out enough space on the back that a 5mm LED will comfortably fit with only the round part sticking out. It involved a few passes with the Dremel, checking the fit every so often. You can see that the LED is going to end up sitting in there quite nicely. It's only the uncut legs on this one that are stopping it from being fully straight. I think once it's given a lick of paint, they're going to look just fine. Here we go then. I've done the wiring off camera, as while it's not impossible to do on camera, remember I've got a large camera between my face and my hand, so half the time I can't actually see what I'm doing. I wired these up, sat nice and comfortably at my desk. As a description, we've got 3 LEDs wired with a common anode. Each of the cathodes goes through a resistor, so that's a total of 3 resistors. The reverse light then has one of the black wires in the twisted cable. The 2 tail light resistors are connected together and connect to the second black wire. I'm sure that was clear as mud. My plan is to include various diagrams with the instructions for the controller board, so they can easily just be copied for various installs. To keep the LEDs in position, I'm going to use some Zapper Gap, a gap filling Sino. Normally I tend to use something like Yoo-Hoo Pour as it remains flexible, but the tail lights here are going to need some firmer support. And since I've got the Sino out, I think we'll probably end up using it for the rest too. Once the Sino's fully dried, I'll be painting the tail lights with some clear red on the outside and painting the inside with black to hide the LEDs, and more importantly, try and stop the light leaking where we don't want it. So, with the LEDs painted up and having given them time to dry, we can refit the tray to the chassis. There shouldn't be any need to ever remove it again, hopefully. Okay, headlights next, and since we're going to remove the plate that covers the electronics at some point, we might as well remove it now. It's just the 2 screws and a little bit of electrical tape we use to stick the antenna somewhere safe. Now, one of my favourite things about this little truck is how the headlights and grille are attached to the bumper and chassis rather than the cab. That will mean we can hardwire the lights without having to add some sort of connector, just so we can remove the cab later. There's a couple of screws that hold it to the radio tray, take them out and the whole bumper and grille combo comes away. The grille has 2 headlights that take 5mm LEDs, so they're going to be easy enough to fit. Down in the bumper there's 2 more holes that look like they're going to accept 3mm LEDs, so we're going to fit 4 LEDs and try and get as much useful light as we can. Just like the rear tray, I've already wired up the LEDs. In this case, they're all connected together with a resistor per LED. All we need to do is pop the LEDs into their holes. The headlights will stay put as they are. They have a little clip mounted that grabs the LED skirt. The 3mm LEDs in the bumper are a really loose fit though, so since you've got it out, a drop of zapper gap will keep them in position. If I wasn't recording this at the wrong side of midnight, I'd probably go downstairs and grab the Yoo-hoo, but that does seem like a lot of effort when the bottle of Sino's sitting right here. While that dries, we can have a look at the roll bar lights. This time I've wired them up in 2 pairs, so that's 2 on the left and 2 on the right. That way we can take advantage of one of the features of the light controller, but we'll see that effect later. For now we'll just pop the LEDs in the holes and run the wires around to the front of the roll bar. The resistors are packed in some heat shrink and fit in the areas next to the battery hatch. So the wires can get into the battery box, we'll need to cut a slot on each side for the wires. Just a quick touch of the Dremel is all we need to do. With the slot slotted and the wires pressed in, it all looks tidy enough. The twisted wires will end up between the cab and the roll bar, so they're going to get neatly tucked out of sight. Before we fit them and the grille to the chassis, we'll need to paint the back of all the LEDs in black, just like we did with the tail lights. Once the paint's had time to dry, we can refit the bumper and roll bar to the chassis. The bumper goes on with its 2 screws. This time we have to keep an eye on the wires to make sure nothing gets pinched. There is a fair bit of space, but it's still good to be careful. For now the roll bar just presses into position. It's fixed with screws that also hold the rear of the cab on. It'll do for now though. It does just about stay in position as long as you're not too rough with it. The roll bar wiring needs something to keep it in position. Now I already drilled a hole in the plastic tray for the rear lights, so I think we might as well drill another one next to it for the roll bar. It'll keep things neat and stop anything getting in a tangle with the battery. There we go, and with the wires twisted up, it's going to stay up and out of the way quite nicely. Right, now things can get a bit more interesting. Here we have the mini light controller. Hopefully a couple are going to be available very soon, with more to follow. The firmware is 99% there, there's just a couple of bits that need finalising. On the top of the board, and I'm going to pause the video here, we've got the output down the left hand side. The pads with the plus, the big square ones, are the positive supply that go off to the LED anodes. And we've got the headlights, HL, tail lights, TL, and reverse, RV, which connects to the cathodes of the LEDs that you want them to control. The last two, A1 and A2, are auxiliary outputs which have a couple of available functions. That brings us to the opt A, B and C solder jumpers. Now depending on which ones are jumped, the lights will come on in a different order. Now depending on which ones are jumped, the lights will come on in a different order and with different effects. A has a value of 1, B2 and C4. Now if you know your binary, you know where this is going. Option table 0 has no jumpers fitted, and at the other end, option table 7 has all 3 jumped. Now these are just preliminary tables, but I think they cover most uses fairly well. There will of course be some setup info in the instructions, maybe with an example of where they might be used. And of course, if you buy any of my electronic bits, I'm always more than happy to help you one-to-one. Anyway, enough of that, let's get it fitted. The board is designed to fit around the flat space on the top of a 3-channel FlySky receiver. Unfortunately, we had to remove the one on this truck from its case, so there's not really a flat space to stick the board. However, this servo tape is the most sticky, tough tape I've ever come across, so even if there's only a few patches that are actually in contact, it's still going to be good enough. To connect the board to the radio, all we do is unplug the ESC from channel 2 on the receiver and plug it into the 3-pin connector on the light controller. The 3-pin servo connector on the lead from the light controller now plugs into the throttle channel, channel 2, on the receiver. And the slightly oddball single socket needs to be carefully connected to the signal pin on channel 3. If it's plugged into the wrong pin, it's not going to blow up or anything, but you will get an error from the controller. All we need to do now, before we can test it, is cut, strip, tin and solder the wires to the pads on the board. The anodes to the pad with a plus, and the cathodes to all the other pads. It's easy enough to do. I've tried to keep the spacing between the pads big enough to make it very difficult to accidentally bridge them. If you can safety wield an Antex Fire Stick or equivalent, you'll be able to solder up all the wires just fine. So with them all soldered up, we can turn on the transmitter, connect up a LiPo to the ESC, and find that the ESC was already turned on. Never mind though, it does seem to be working. The green LED that's on the controller, which was almost impossible to see on the first board we fitted to the B1, now has a much brighter LED. In a dimly lit room you can see the light through the blue PCB. Right now it'll blink rapidly when it's trying to measure the channel's neutral point. Then it will blink even more rapidly when it's waiting for you to start driving forward. It's another one of those little things that needs a bit of a tweak in the firmware, as the two self-setup steps are really hard to tell apart. Looking at the back of the truck, we now have brake lights and the reverse light working. It doesn't quite come on at the right time. I guessed a value and I didn't quite get it right, but that's a quick fix. From the front we can see the rest of the lights working. The transmitter's set up with a 3-position momentary switch, so we can change the modes. The light controller can detect if you've only got a basic 2-position channel 3 though, and it will still work quite nicely. We're using option table 2, so first we have dipped headlights, followed by full headlights. Next A1 and A2 come on, which are connected to the two halves of the roll bar light. Now the next one is where things get a bit funky, wigwag mode, which toggles A1 and A2 back and forth. Quite a good attention getter, but if that's not enough, we've got a strobing wigwag. In the dark, that really stands out. Of course, there may be times when even that's not enough, so we can go again to get the headlight strobing too. When you're done making a visual nuisance of yourself, you can go back through the modes to something a bit more visually stable. The cab mounting plate can go back on now, but first we need to make a quick tweak. The wires that go off to the tail lights and roll bar need a slot cutting so they don't get pinched. A quick buzz with the Dremel is all we need to do. Right, now we can fit the plate with its 2 screws, being very careful all the wires are where they should be and not getting pinched. The antenna can get restuck to the plate too, and since a roll of tape is all the way downstairs, I'm going to reuse the bit we removed earlier. Surprisingly, the sticky's still good. Cab on next with its screws, and because there's no lights and flying leads to worry about, it's really easy to mount up. It just slots in and all the screws go back. And there we go, job done. We can connect up and install the 2S LiPo, and it's ready for its maiden voyage. Now, we could test it out here on the bench, but that's no fun, and besides it's going to be slightly out of focus like the rest of the video. Instead, I think we're going to be better outside, at 2 AM Saturday morning, between rain showers. I say between, but it was only just. Now I've got a massive great LED camera light that's lighting up most of the scene. I was planning on recording a couple of clips with varying light intensity to really show the truck's lights at their best. Instead, I got one run lasting about 2 minutes before it started raining again, so that's all I got. It was still a 5-minute walk home, and I only just made it before it really started chucking it down. Oh well, I'm sure you get the idea. With the headlights and roll bar lights on, you could fairly comfortably drive in the dark. It's not like the collapsed sun that is the roof light on the TRX4, but it is adequate. So that's it for this week then. Next week we're going to get stuck into the G-Made GOM build with the axles, so that should be fun. For now though, if you like the video, do please leave a like, it's always greatly appreciated. Subscribe if you haven't, and of course leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!